Hi, thank you for coming. I'm sorry we're late. Our independent expert was held up in the committee room. So we are having a press conference now with the independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, Mr. Victor Madrigal-Borloz. So he will say a few words about his presentation, which was this morning to the third committee, and then take questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and good morning. This is the first of my reports to the third committee. I started the mandate on 1st of January of this year, and I benefited from the framework that was created by Victor Madrigal-Borloz, which consists of six thematic underpinnings for the mandate. Last year, he presented a report on decriminalization and effective anti-discrimination measures, and this year I have dedicated myself to the thematic development of legal recognition of gender identity and depathologization of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. The report deals substantively with the process of depathologizing certain forms of sexual orientation and gender identity, and with the process of legal gender recognition, which is affecting mostly trans and gender diverse persons, and which consists on measures to ensure that the legal personality that they are granted by the state corresponds to the gender with which they self-identify. The report was crafted at the same time as an important measure of depathologization by the World Health Organization, which in the 11th version of the International Classification of Diseases has now eliminated the conception of gender identity as a pathology and has now transformed it into one of the conditions described under sexual diversity. So the report very much aims at bringing visibility to the situation of trans and gender diverse persons around the world. It describes a situation which can only be described as disastrous. These persons are suffering levels of violence and discrimination that are, as I have said, offensive to human conscience. They live in what can only be characterized as a situation of total rupture with the state services in what concerns education, health, housing, and other sectors. And part of that situation is derived from the fact that they are not enjoying legal recognition that matches their appearance and their existence. And therefore, the measures adopted to ensure that there's conformity between their self-identified gender and the legal recognition are of fundamental importance to prevent violence and discrimination against them. I note in the report that most of trans persons around the world are not granted legal recognition of their self-identified gender identity, but that there are a significant number of measures that are being adopted, legal, public policy, and judgments that are actually making significant progress in relation to this issue. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So are you representing UNCA?
I guess so.
Okay, thank you. Please. It's on.
Hi, Mr. Madrigal. Welcome. Thank you for the briefing. A lot of people are watching from upstairs, so don't be dispirited. I'm Margaret Bashir. I'm with the Voice of America. Just a few questions for you, since I don't have competition. First of all, the report was pretty, in terms of countries, it was pretty positive looking at steps countries have taken, but some of those countries I wouldn't have considered LGBT-friendly countries, so I was wondering why there was no criticism in there. You know, you had a lot of Muslim countries in there. You have Pakistan and Bangladesh saying that they've taken steps to give a third gender identity, but yet no mention of harassment and things that homosexuals may or trans people may have in those countries. Also, you mentioned Russia and China in a positive light, which sort of surprised me. So could you talk a bit about where your concerns lie, and then we'll take it from there, I guess.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you very much. One of the points that I made in the presentation of the report is that this area actually identifies good and best practice from all regions of the world. And it leads me to the suspicion that there is a historical recognition of the fact that a diversity of gender identities have been recognized in all cultures and traditions around the world, and that the outlawing or stigmatizing surrounding certain gender expressions have been more the result of certain processes, in some cases colonial domination, in some cases normalization based on certain conceptions of gender. But I do believe that there is enough evidence that in long-standing cultural and societal tradition, gender diversity has played a role in all corners of the world, and I identify some of that historical evidence. And therefore, I think that this is an issue that clearly reveals good practice from corners that, as you say, have historical positions that are more reluctant to recognize, for example, protection to sexual orientation and diversity in sexual orientation. And I think it has to do with that, those elements in culture and society that are perhaps continuing in the social fabric in a way that is not necessarily affected completely by this legislation that may be derived of colonialism and other aspects. Where is it that my concerns lie? My concerns lie on the fact that between these glimmers of positivism, and I might not be very technical, but I'll describe them as glimmers of hope, there are pervasive notions that identify trans persons, for example, with criminal culture in society. I have received numerous testimonies of trans persons throughout my career where they describe that it is the conviction of the police that there's no need to actually have a reason to detain them and to actually send them to detention overnight, because there is an expectation that trans persons are actually associated automatically with certain activities that are criminalized, such as sex work, for example. That means that the level of violence are very, very high against this community. The exclusion that I referred to from state services and from the formality of the state also means that they have very little access to health services. It is very often that trans persons will describe the humiliating experience of having a name that they don't really identify with, of a gender that they don't identify with, screamed out loud in the waiting room of a health service, and how for hours after that they have to endure humiliation. They will not be typically employed because their documents do not correspond with their appearance, and that's also stigmatizing. So the levels of exclusion are quite significant, and therefore there is a situation that requires immediate and prompt action of the state to actually make sure that these persons are not left behind in the philosophy, of course, of the Sustainable Development Goals. There is a cross-cutting issue of concerns in relation to gender identity, which is criminalization. Even though criminalization may only be referring to sexual orientation, there is a compounded effect on gender identity. As of today, there are 71 countries that still criminalize diversity in sexual orientations and gender identities. A number of those, some 20 countries, actually criminalize certain activities or certain forms of gender identity. And clearly, criminalization is therefore creating a situation where persons are not only not protected, but actually actively persecuted on the basis of their gender identity.
Thank you. A further question? Oh, I'm sorry, the lady, yes. Yes, please. Could you identify your media, please? Thank you.
Yes, Ann Charles, Baltic Review. Can you tell me about the Baltics? How receptive they are to LGBT rights?
I think one of the elements that has created great strides in the European space is actually the creation of diagnostics and plans of actions that are based on regional action in relation to this issue. And I think there is a commonality between Scandinavian and Baltic states in pursuing public policy that is actually formally and substantially supporting progress in relation to the protection and recognition of LGBTI rights. Now, the issue is that every country faces challenges when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity, and it cannot be a given because there's no country that is exempt from homophobic violence and transphobic violence. These are manifestations everywhere. But of course, the countries that you're making reference to, they have legislation that is quite protective in its nature, and usually it's only a question of how vigilant authorities are of criminal conduct and hate crimes and hate speech, which are more, of course, belonging to the criminal activity.
Thank you. Further? Yes, please.
Could you talk a little about the life expectancy issue? I think the EU delegate may have brought it up in the in your presentation today, and I thought that was an interesting factor. Could you confirm that and go into it a bit?
Absolutely, I can confirm that one of the challenges that we face in relation to trans persons and gender diverse persons is the absence of data, which means that there's only a few elements that one can go about, but one of the efforts in gathering data has been done in Latin America, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has cited for a while the figure of 35 years old as life expectancy for trans women. And I hope that whenever that number is cited, there is an invitation to a realization of the horror in human terms that this means. It means that a woman reaching the age of 17 is in middle age, and by the age she's 22 or 23, she's beginning to be an old woman. And that's a reality that is created because of exposure to violence and very high rates of transicide and prevalence of HIV/AIDS that are actually 49 times more, 49 times fold than what is the general population. And again, the exclusion, the economic conditions created by exclusion, which all compound to create that life expectancy. And one of the issues that I was bringing up, thanks to the question of one of the delegations, is that measures that are adopted immediately begin to have a reflection on an increase in that life expectancy. Because the population beginning to actually have access to health services, to employment, begins to actually have the benefits in a very, very clear way of access to these services. So I think it's important to gather data, but it's also important to act immediately on the presumption that the levels of life expectancy are unacceptably low and disproportionately affecting the trans population.
Thank you. Further follow-up?
Follow-up. Could you talk about children a bit? You mentioned children in the report in terms of deciding their own gender identity, but also what special vulnerabilities do they face?
Of course, and this is a very interesting issue. There was a question by a delegation in relation to whether I could identify an optimum age for children to decide on their gender identity. And for that specific issue, I researched and was assisted by the jurisprudence of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which very clearly makes a relationship between freedom of expression and the right to identity of children and their ability to actually have access to these rights based upon an understanding of incremental capacities of the child, which means that actually there is not such a thing as one ideal age that is determined. I think good and best practice establishes a standard, but there's always protections that are created to ensure that children are, for example, not undergoing non-regressive procedures, and that their incremental capacity will be taken into account when taking decisions in relation to gender. The vulnerabilities are the ones that one can identify in a population that, because of precisely the incremental nature of their capacity and their building, face in relation to every right. There is a need to ensure well-informed understanding of how children are making these decisions, and a legal understanding of how they're assisted to take them through. Something that evidently can only exist when there's also a work of eliminating stigma and discrimination. Because what the challenge is that children that are exploring gender identities that are not necessarily binary or that don't correspond with the sex assigned at birth are vulnerable to levels of bullying and persecution in every context, including schools. And this is one of the reasons why children leave school and end up having very low scolarities, and therefore compounding that effect of exclusion.
Thank you. Any further questions? Well, I want to thank you very much. It was most interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much.